welcome to another video. Today I am going to be experimenting with using alcohol markers and watercolor in the same piece. So if you're interested in learning about how that works, and if it works, then you are in the right place. I am starting using the Bailey J sketchbook because it is the paper that I know can take both watercolor and alcohol markers. So I'm not worried about it being able to take either of those. I know that it works well with both, so I figured it was a good paper to work with for this experiment. I went ahead and drew in my sketch using the tritone colored pencils. I really love using the tritone colored pencils because they have different colors that kind of match. So this green one has a dark green, a light green, and a yellow green in the tip. And so it kind of adds this variety and interest to your sketch. I'm just a big fan of working in them. So I went ahead and sketched out a mermaid with that. I'm going to be drawing a swamp mermaid sitting on a tree kind of in this swampy lake area. So that's kind of what we're going for here, just sketching that out really lightly. And for the rest of my supplies, I'm going to be using the Tombow alcohol markers as well as the Core watercolor paints. And then later on, I'm also going to add in some Paul Rubens glitter paints, and then I'm going to use a variety of different colored pencils from Derwent, Posca, and Prismacolor. When I have my overall sketch established, I use an eraser to erase it so that it's just a lot lighter of a sketch, and then I use a darker colored tritone to go over and establish the details and get my line art more in the way that I want it, because I'm not a big fan of using pens for line art. I tend to have really shaky hands, and so it's just kind of harder for me. And I also really like the softer look that colored pencil gives, so I decided to keep it colored pencil for this sketch. It's not May, but I love drawing mermaids, especially I have an affinity for the idea of a swamp mermaid. I don't know why, but I just really like the idea of a little mermaid that lives in a swamp and just hangs out there with all of the vines and the nature, and it's just something that I really love. So I always draw swamp mermaids. It's like when I'm going to draw a mermaid, that's my first thought, is to draw a swamp merm. And then I also kind of have this willow tree that's inspired a little bit by Pocahontas and like grandmother willow. So I wanted to put that in, and I added in some little details with the colored pencil, just adding in some loose leaves. Even though they're mostly going to get covered up later, I want to remember that I want to put them in, so that's why I'm putting them really quickly into the sketch. And once I'm happy with the sketch, I'm going to start in with the alcohol marker. I don't consider myself like an expert in alcohol marker by any means. I really don't know what I'm doing. I feel like I paint or use alcohol markers basically just based on vibes. So I start with like a medium tone, this kind of darker sage kind of green that I had that I thought was going to be really good for her skin tone. I wanted to use all of the Tombow alcohol markers for this because originally I wanted this video to be a review of the Tombow alcohol markers. And then I decided I wanted to add in watercolor because it wasn't quite working the way that I wanted it to. And it became, let's see what happens if we use watercolor and alcohol markers together. So using the Tombow markers was interesting. They do blend pretty decently, I feel. I feel like the brush tip gets kind of soft really quickly. But the biggest issue I had was I just didn't feel like I had enough light colors. Even the light tones felt more like mid-tones when I put them on. Like even this yellow you can see is not like the lightest yellow. And I just didn't really feel like I had the versatility of lights and darks that I needed. I did have a decent few darks, so I was able to use it for that, but I just wanted more colors. But that said, I worked with it. I stuck it out. I did only use the Tombow alcohol markers for this, and I used a lot of layering techniques, layering on greens on top of the yellows and yellows on top of the blues to get the variety of different tones that I needed. I did have a couple issues with things kind of blurring out, especially in the hand. I really struggled, but at this point I was like hoping that I would be able to bring it back with some watercolor and some colored pencil. So I just moved on to getting some basic layers in the tail and getting some different tones in there. I wanted some blue tones and some green tones, so it kind of looked like it had those different reflections in it. And also figuring out how the light was going to fall on the tail, and based on how I had it fall on her body, I kind of have this shadow cast from her tail over her hand. So I wanted to try to be semi-consistent with the light source. Light source consistency is not really my strong suit. So I did try to keep it in mind in this piece, but it's definitely not perfect. But I'm overall happy, I think, with how it turned out. I do make some modifications later once I'm done adding in the hair. And I used that same dark sage blue-green to add in the hair and some dark to the hair, and also added in some darker with some blue, like a blue-gray. But overall, I'm keeping the hair pretty relatively flat at this point. I'm not doing too much to it. I'm going to add in a little bit more detail as I go with the hair. I'm just establishing where the different kind of chunks in the hair are. And then I felt like I needed to adjust the shadow on the fin, the tail. And once I was done with that, I wanted to add some texture, and this is where the watercolor experiment truly starts. So I added water on top of the whole tail, and it didn't smudge anything below. I didn't really expect it to, because alcohol markers tend to be pretty stuck down when they're on there, but just so you know, it doesn't smudge the marker below. I was able to do a wet on wet, so I filled the whole tail in with water, and then I dropped in a variety of different blue tones and some green tones to add a mottled texture onto her tail. And that's kind of how I started the experiment of, can you use watercolor and alcohol markers together? And layering watercolor over alcohol markers definitely works really well. You can layer it just like you would layer over anything else. It's kind of a nice way to establish your base shades, because you don't have to worry about the watercolor lifting off anything below it. So any of the shading or any of the colors below it, the watercolor is not going to lift it off, so you can really layer on top of it. And because the alcohol markers are also translucent, it doesn't really take away from the translucent effect that watercolors have. So I actually think that they play really nicely together, and it's a really interesting combination to use. I started using some greens and blues to establish the swampy kind of lake or ocean type thing that she's hanging out in. And again, just using watercolor for that. One of the reasons I wanted to incorporate watercolor was because I thought it would be better for the background to really get some nice texture and some water-like effects. So that's kind of why I was like, let's just see what happens when we combine these. So adding in some sky and then dropping down some green for where all that foliage is going to be at the top, and letting it blur down into the rest of the painting, creating this really nice kind of soft effect. And then letting everything dry and going back in with the second layer of alcohol marker, which is where we get to see how well alcohol marker works on top of watercolor. So I was able to lay things down just fine. I didn't have any issues with that. When it came to blending was a little bit difficult. I did find that blending wasn't as smooth or as easy as blending without it having watercolor underneath, and it felt like the paper was just a little bit more absorbent, so it absorbed the alcohol markers a little bit faster, and I think that's just from adding the watercolor on top. But it worked so well to add in sharper, darker details, especially within the hair, and adding in some little texture in the scales. I was really excited about how these two work together, because I can see a lot of potential uses for it in the future, especially with adding in details in different parts of shading. I wanted to create some more texture on her tail, so I went in with watercolor and added in more details to the scaling, and just trying to create that texture on her tail, and add in some more darks so that it looks really shiny, and some reflection of yellow for the whole area around her. I wanted to add in a lot of yellow and have this whole thing feel like it was bathed in this yellow-green light, and the light is really filtering through all of the foliage that is hanging around her. It's kind of what I wanted. And I also wanted this mottled texture to her skin, because it is green skin and she's a mermaid. I didn't want her skin to be like super smooth. I wanted a little bit of texture to it. I went in and added a base layer for the tree with some brown watercolor, just throwing that on there. I'm not worrying too much about accuracy or being perfect with my brush strokes, because I'm going to be layering over this a bunch with both watercolor and with marker, and then throwing in some really dark darks to establish where that big shadow is going to be underneath her, because the light is kind of coming on her and catching on her edge, and then both her hand and part of her tail are kind of sunken into shadow. So I want to try to remember that, instead of just forgetting that I actually have a light source. Since I'm establishing the overall atmosphere, I also decided to add in some fun little splatters for some texture, especially on the tree. And I just splattered water into the wet paint, and that creates this cool little like spotted effect. And once everything was dry, I decided to go in and use the brown marker that I had. I only had one brown marker, which was a little disappointing, to put in some swirlies and some definition to the tree and the tree bark itself. And then I went ahead with with this yellow to add in some yellow and try to blend things out a little bit more. But like I said, it was harder to blend once the watercolor was down. And then I added in some gray to tone everything down and add in more shading, and went back in with that green that I'm using pretty much everywhere because I figured the tree would have some moss on it, and it worked really well for kind of a mid-tone, especially when layering on top of the other colors. I also added in the willow kind of leaves, vines that are hanging in the front, and reestablished kind of the shadow around where she's sitting so that it's nice and dark, and I could go around the hands and try to kind of crisp up the lines around the hands and reestablish where things are. I just went in and reestablished some darks, really working on making sure that shading is looking the way I want, and just going over everything to make sure it's as blended as it can possibly be. When using alcohol markers, like I said, I'm not an expert, but I just like to add lots and lots of layers until everything looks blended in the way I want it to. Obviously, you can add too many layers, but I'm a big fan of layering. I went over the whole thing with water, and it didn't smudge anything, which was so fun and exciting to work with. And then I added in some yellows and greens towards the top and some blues at the bottom. Again, I'm still trying to establish an entire atmosphere for this entire painting. Then I went to add in some glitter, so I opened up my Paul Rubens glitter watercolors and splatter the whole thing with some light metallic sage green to add in some metallic before I go in with more details. This way the metallic is kind of sandwiched in with the details and will just kind of peek and shine through in certain areas, which I think is a really cool effect, and I really enjoy it. Once that's dry, I go back in with some watercolor to add in some more details. As you can see, I'm a big fan of layering. I really do encourage you guys to experiment with your art supplies. If I hadn't decided I wonder what happens if you mix alcohol and watercolor, then I wouldn't have ever made this piece, and I actually think it came out really, really cute. I'm really happy with the overall effect, and I would have never tried these two together if I hadn't just been like, well, I wonder what happens. Let's just see what happens. If you've ever had a thought in your head that's like, I wonder what would happen if, follow through with that thought, so long as it's not like, I wonder what would happen if I jumped off a bridge or something like that. We're talking artistic thoughts. What would happen if I combine this supply with this supply? What would happen if I combine these two colors? You won't know until you try. And if you don't try, you may never find something, a really cool effect that you end up loving. Some of my favorite techniques that I use now have been created entirely through experimentation and playing around with different things. Creativity isn't just in what your actual subject matter is or the colors that you use, it's experimentation with your actual media as well. If you're worried about developing your own style, try playing around with different mediums and how you can combine them, the different effects and textures that you can get from them, because so much of your style is also defined by how you use your media. Something that defines my style is huge amounts of layers. I love layering, whether it's in watercolor, acrylic, marker, whatever it is that I'm doing, I tend to put in a bunch of different layers. Figure out what your unique signature is, and don't be afraid to experiment to find out what it is. I'm adding in lots of little details to this area of land that I added underneath the tree by using some markers. And then I'm also going back in with the markers and adding in all of the leaves that are in the background, which is super easy to do with markers because the shape of the nib, you can just press it down and you get this perfect little leaf shape. So I did all the ones on the left, and then I flipped the page upside down and did all the ones on the right. This is just a lot easier. The first two, I didn't do that, and then I realized I was making my life harder and working against myself. So I definitely recommend not working against yourself. If you're doing something that's making your life harder, stop doing it. Just make your life easier. Trust me. Once I had that, I put on another layer of water and added in a wash of green over the whole page. And then I splattered in some yellow and some blue-green, as well as adding in a little bit of water to throw some texture over the entire thing, because you can't have enough texture if you're me. And once that was done and dry, I went in with some colored pencils to add in some more definition. I frequently use colored pencils on top of watercolor to add in final details and to cover up any mistakes because they do tend to be a bit more opaque. I was able to use this to define my line art a little bit more so that it establishes her shape a little bit more and she pops out from the background a little bit more, whereas before she was kind of fading into the background. And I can also use it to add in highlights and little areas of extra shadow, adding in areas of extra tone, and I'm especially a big fan of it for adding in highlights and hair. So using colored pencil on top is definitely something that I really enjoy and encourage you to try. I'm using it to add in some blue tint to the tail, and I think it really adds to everything. I'm also using a pastel pencil to add in a really bright highlight to the tail so that it looks nice and shiny. I'm also a big fan of using pastel pencils because you can blur and smudge them out so they work really nicely on top of watercolor. I'm also using that same pastel pencil to add in some highlights to the top of the water so it actually looks like her tail is dipping in the water, not sitting on top of it, and so that it looks like the water is kind of touching the edges of the tree and the land next to it. I really love using mixed media and using all different things, so don't feel like if you're using watercolor or markers that you just have to use that one specific media. You can add in different things. You can add in watercolors, you can add in colored pencil and pens and Poscas and pastels and play around with using different media, because instead of trying to force your entire painting to fit the one media that you want it to be in, use the media that is appropriate for what it is that you're looking for. Don't try to put yourself into a box that you don't have to put yourself into. I'm finishing everything up by adding in some final metallic details because I love metallic and I want it in everything. And that is basically my finished piece. I really like how it came out, and I really love this technique of combining watercolor and alcohol markers. If you've ever tried this technique, let me know how it went down in the comments below. And if you're going to try it, let me know as well. I'd love to hear your feedback on this video. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a great rest of your day. Bye, guys!